So in December of 2014, a little girl by the name of Molly was brutally murdered in Windsor, Ontario. Now, when the police arrived on scene, which was the home that Molly had lived in for about 7 months, they found her together with her mom, Cassandra, who had been murdered as well. The man who perpetrated these horrible crimes against Molly and her mom was caught and then charged with first-degree murder. But while justice was brought for Cassandra, it was not for Molly. While her father mourned 2 deaths, only 1 was legally recognized. Now, how is that possible? Well, as Andre just explained, because the criminal code says that unless you have fully emerged from your mother's body, you are not considered a human being under the law. And Molly hadn't been born yet. And so because of that, in Canada, you can directly and intentionally kill a preborn child in her mother's body by stabbing her in the abdomen and get away with it. And that needs to change. Now, around the same time that Molly died, there was a couple in British Columbia who were eagerly anticipating the birth of their first child. And as many people do, around 20 weeks, they had an ultrasound done to determine the gender of their baby. But when the results came in, instead of celebrating by going to the store and buying a bouquet of flowers or maybe a pink onesie, instead, they made an appointment. They got into their vehicle, and they drove to an abortion clinic for a so-called dilation and evacuation procedure. And during that procedure, the doctor would go in and dilate the woman's cervix, and he would then go in with forceps and grasp a limb and twist it and pull it out. And then he would go back in and grasp another limb and twist it and pull it out, until finally only the head is left. And the forceps would go back in until the doctor would crush the head and then pull that out as well. How is that possible? Because there are ethnic communities in our country that devalue girls to such an extent that rather than giving birth to these little girls, they would have them decapitated, dismembered, and disemboweled. And it shouldn't surprise us because there are no protections for preborn children whatsoever. An undercover CBC investigation found that sex selection abortion happens across our country. And the Canadian Medical Association Journal reported a study that showed that there are communities in our country where there are many more boys being born than girls, precisely because of this. And that needs to change as well. But that little girl that was decapitated, dismembered, and disemboweled was not the only one who died that day. Hundreds of little girls were walked to their death in hospitals and abortion clinics across our nation through a procedure called dilation and curettage, also known as a vacuum aspiration abortion, where the developing human being is suctioned into pieces. And so an unrepeatable human being is reduced to an unrecognizable bloody mess. Because the large majority of abortions happen during the first trimester of pregnancy, where you can't even recognize the developing child anymore after that has been done to it, or to her, or his body. How is that possible? Because there are no protections, and because since 1988, you can have an abortion for any reason or no reason whatsoever. And so in Canada, you can have human rights. You just have to be born first. Now, how do we respond to that? How can we let that go on? A few weeks ago, I brought our oldest son, Jonah, to kindergarten, where he started his first day of school. And it struck me on that day that there's about 20 kids in his class. And on the very day that my son went to kindergarten, 15 kindergarten classes full of children were killed through abortion that very day. And again the next day. And again the next day. And also today. So what do we do? The Apostle Paul in Ephesians 5 verse 11 says, not only to abstain from the deeds of darkness, but also to expose them. And so what we must do is expose abortion for the evil that it is. Social reform movements of the past knew that. that if they wanted to fight and end the injustice of their time, like slavery or child labor or segregation, they had to expose it. They had to show people in their culture the humanity of the victims and the inhumane nature of the injustice they were fighting. And so we have to do the same. We have to take and we have to make opportunities to make a case for the humanity of preborn children, as Andre just explained, and also show the inhumane nature of abortion. Because there are far too many people in our country who have no idea. When I go to high schools and I show what abortion does to the preborn, there are girls who come up to me and say, nobody told me when I had my abortion. And no girl in our country should ever be allowed or be able to say that. My colleague Deborah, some time ago, stood on the streets of Toronto with one of her public outreach campaigns, and there was a woman who was walking down the street, and she was clearly in a rush. She was not looking at the display. She was looking ahead of her. She was going to ignore Deborah. And so in order to engage her, Deborah stuck out her hand with the pamphlet, and she said, "What do you think about abortion?" The woman grabbed the pamphlet, kept walking, opened the pamphlet, and then stopped. And she said, "Abortion? Abortion kills the baby." And Deborah and this woman engaged in a conversation and talked about the difficult circumstances that drive women to abortion. They talked about how we should eliminate suffering, but not by killing sufferers. And at the end of the conversation, Deborah said, "So now that you've seen abortion, has that changed at all how you think about it?" And the woman said, "Oh, I was pro-choice until I opened your pamphlet. Until she saw what abortion does to the bodies of the youngest of our kind, she supported it. But she could no longer once she saw it." My colleague Jonathan, several years ago, stood in front of a gap display, which is a display that we use on university campuses, and we draw parallels to atrocities of the past. Now, he'd received the training, and so he knew how to engage with people, and he was ready to take on some pro-choicers and hopefully win them over. But the first person who walked by was an African-American woman. And so he asked her, "What do you think about abortion?" And she looked at him and said, "I had one a few weeks ago." Now, all of a sudden, Jonathan didn't know what to say anymore, because he could convince her that abortion was wrong, but it was too late. He could make a case for the humanity of her child, but her child was already dead. And so instead, self-conscious about the picture she was standing in front of, he asked her, "What do you think about our images then?" And as tears welled up in her eyes, she said, "Nobody told me it looked like that." Now, she had to go to class shortly after, so Jonathan walked with her to class, and she told him how she had tattooed the name Raven, the name that she had given her little girl, across her abdomen and close to the place that her little girl had lived until she was aborted. But in a culture where many people call themselves pro-life and call themselves Christian, the only person that was willing to talk to that girl about abortion was the doctor who took her money and then killed her baby. And so we owe it to girls like that to show them what abortion would do. Because if they make that abortion choice in ignorance, then their sin of commission is our sin of omission. See, when we show these pictures, things change. Some time ago, we were standing on the streets of Hamilton, because every year CCBR holds a crash course where people from all over the country come, and we train them in all kinds of things, and then they join us for activism on the streets. Well, last fall, we were standing on the streets of Hamilton when our volunteer Christine was talking to a man who was angry. He was yelling at her and saying, "How can you show these pictures in public? There are children who see them." And Christine explained that we too think it's a shame that some born children would have to see these images, but that parents can explain that their children are loved and that they're doing everything they can to make sure that this doesn't happen to other children. And when we have no other choice but to show these pictures in public, because otherwise no one will come to see them, we have to prioritize the lives of preborn children over the feelings of born children. And then she said to this man, "And we need to make sure people know what abortion does, because there might be women walking around here who are pregnant, and maybe when they see this, they'll reconsider having an abortion." And at that moment, a soft-spoken woman, who Christine hadn't noticed up until then, said, "Yes, and I'm one of them." Now, the angry man all of a sudden vanished into thin air. And Christine was able to talk to this woman, and it turned out that she was in an abusive relationship and that her boyfriend had told her that if she wasn't going to have an abortion, he would kill her. And so she was told that pro-lifers wouldn't do anything for you because they only care about embryos and fetuses. But in Christine and in our team, she found a group of people who provided her the help and support she needed to leave this man and to then continue her pregnancy. And this past March, on a cold morning, we received this picture of Noah. And Noah is alive because his brave mom saw what abortion would have done to his tiny body, and that's when she knew she couldn't do it. And not too long ago, Noah's mom told us that he gives her reason to sing again. There are many more children like Noah. I could stand here all night and tell you stories like this, because that's what happens. When we engage the culture, that's how the culture changes. Once I was standing on the streets with one of our projects, and it was a woman who walked by, and she had already talked to some of my colleagues, and she was angry. And when I asked her what she thought about abortion, she said, "I want the right to suck a fetus out of my uterus if I want to." And I looked at her and I said, "How come?" And she said, "Well, there are very difficult circumstances, and who are you to tell women that they can't have abortions then?" And I said, "I agree with you that there are very difficult circumstances. But shouldn't we do everything we can to help the mother and her child and not kill the child in our order to help the mother?" And she said, "It's not a child. It's not even a person, let alone a human being." And I said, "So, can I ask you something else? Do you believe in human rights?" And she said, "Of course I do." I said, "Well, who gets human rights?" "Humans," she said. She said, "Okay, so if two parents reproduce and they are human, what kind of species will their offspring be?" She thought for a moment. She said, "Well, human, I guess." I said, "Okay, so, and if something is growing, doesn't it mean that it is alive?" She said, "Well, yes." "Okay, so from the moment of fertilization, what is that thing?" "Well, it's human then, I guess," she said, "and it's living." And so because of that, we know that from sperm-egg fusion, there is a living, growing human being. And if abortion ends the life of that living, growing human being, doesn't it mean that abortion is a human rights violation? She thought for a while and she said, "I don't dare to call myself pro-life yet, but when you explain it like that, it makes perfect sense to be against abortion." See, that's what happens when we expose the truth about abortion in love, when we present the human rights argument to a culture that might not know about the value of life, but that does agree with us that human beings have human rights. Well, if that's the case, then the preborn have human rights as well. The bad news is that the sewers of our cities run red with the blood of preborn children. But the good news is that we can change that. And my colleagues and I get to see that every single day when we talk on campuses, when we take to the streets, when we go to high schools. Especially high school students give us hope because they can relate to being bullied. They can understand what it's like to be discriminated against and marginalized because of your age. And so when they see these pictures and hear these arguments, they become pro-life. They're intellectually honest. When we talk to people wherever we go, they change their minds. And so because of that, we have hope that this can be turned around because the truth is on our side. But then it's up to us, like I said, to take and create opportunities to share this truth with the people around us. This past summer, our staff looked like this. 5 years ago, there were 5 people on staff. And this summer, there were 50 people. Because young people want to stand up for their peers who have not made it out of the womb alive. And we just finished the biggest pro-life campaign that Canada has ever seen, No to Trudeau. You may have heard about it. And while the media likes to ignore pro-life messaging, they couldn't resist and cover this. And so we had 145 instances of media coverage because of No to Trudeau. We need to engage the culture in order to change it. That's how public opinion will change. but public policy needs to change as well. And Mike is going to tell you more about that. Thank you.